The humidity in Alabama that night was thick enough to choke a man, a heavy, stagnant blanket that seemed to trap the scent of pine needles and old, unwashed fear. It was the 21st of April, 2017. I was standing in a remote field, the kind of place where the silence is so absolute it feels like it's pressing against your eardrums. I couldn't see a thing. A rough fabric blindfold was tied tight around my head, digging into the bridge of my nose. My heart was a rhythmic hammer against my ribs, but I had to keep my breathing steady. I was instructed to reach out, to find the man in front of me, and place my right hand firmly on his right shoulder. In this world, that simple gesture wasn't just a guide, it was a symbol. It signified brotherhood, but this wasn't a brotherhood of veterans or a local lodge. This was the Ku Klux Klan, the oldest, most notorious white supremacist hate group in the history of the United States. We were in the middle of a ritual, a dark theater of shadows and old, hateful ghosts. What the men surrounding me didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have guessed, was that one of their own was a ghost of a different kind. I was an undercover FBI agent, and I wasn't some rookie playing a part. I was 6'4", 260 pounds of muscle and ink, a man who looked like he'd been forged in the very backwoods they called home. To them, I was a kindred spirit. To the Bureau, I was a specialist. My nickname in those circles? Hillbilly Donnie Brasco. Over the years, I had inhabited a dozen different lives. I had been a contract killer for hire, a smuggler of illicit goods, a high-stakes arms dealer. I had moved through the underworld like a predator, sending dozens of people to federal prison, everyone from mid-level meth cooks to violent motorcycle gang leaders and the kind of predators who target children. I had shared drinks and secrets with outlaw bikers and neo-Nazis, men who spent their nights plotting kidnappings, orchestrating murders, and dreaming of the total collapse of the American government. In my world, language was a code. When a target told me we were going camping, they weren't talking about s'mores and sleeping bags. They were telling me we were going to kill someone. I've stood in circles where men screamed, "Death to your Jewish God," and "Death to America," until their veins popped. And then came the warning, the one that always makes the hair on your neck stand up. If there are any traitors in this group, we kill the traitor. Then, the sound of a handgun, boom, boom, shattering the night. In those moments, you see the mask of bravado slip. You see the fear in their eyes. They're afraid of the very violence they preach. Eventually, we drove all the way to a farm in Tennessee, a place where the air felt a little thinner and the secrets a little heavier. That's where he told us everything. This is the story of Scott Payne, an FBI agent whose career was spent submerged in the dark underbelly of the American dream. This narrative is built on the foundation of Scott Payne's own accounts, his books, and his podcasts, the final links in the chain of a life lived in the shadows. To understand the man I became, you have to understand the boy I was. When I was 14 years old, I saw something that changed the trajectory of my life. I remember it vividly, a blurry, distorted image, pulsing with a deep, visceral red. It was like looking through a veil of blood. And in that red mist, there was a figure, a demon. It was looking right at me with a wide, horrific grin, its long, spindly fingers beckoning me, curling in a come-hither motion. It was smiling, and that smile was the coldest thing I'd ever felt. A year before that, my world had fallen apart. My parents divorced, and I found myself drifting into a very dark place. I was a kid looking for answers in all the wrong rooms. I started consulting spirits, obsessing over demonic horror films, and dabbling in satanic rituals. I was a teenager making deals with the devil because I didn't think anyone else was listening. That's what led me to a friend's house one night. We'd been drinking just booze, no drugs, no hallucinogens, but the atmosphere was already charged with a strange, frantic energy. I was the entertainer of the group. I would do these little performances, pretending to be possessed or acting like I was the devil himself. I was lying on the sofa, channeling a scene from a movie where a demon takes over a human host. I was putting on this elaborate show, struggling with my own voice, letting this guttural, demonic growl take over in a simulated battle for my soul. In the performance, the demon won. I let out this horrific, scripted laugh and rolled over. It started as a game, a way to get a rise out of my friends. But then, the room changed. The air turned cold. I saw that silhouette, the grinning thing with the long fingers. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a moment of absolute, soul-shaking clarity. You could say that after that night, I had the Jesus scared back into me. I was done with the occult, done with the darkness. But as I would learn decades later, the darkness wasn't necessarily done with me. Fast forward to Halloween night, 2019. This was my last major undercover assignment, and I was standing in a circle around a goat. The animal had been stolen, a terrified sacrifice at the center of a pagan ritual. It had been nearly 35 years since I first saw that demon as a teenager, but that night, the air felt exactly the same. The evil was palpable, swirling around us in the woods. I found myself positioned right at the back of the goat. I don't know why, maybe it was just my typical luck, but I was the one tasked with holding its legs. The man leading the ritual, a guy named Eisen, held a long blade. He raised it high, then brought it down in a series of practice swings. Swish, swish, swish. The tension was a physical weight. Finally, someone hissed, "Just do it." Eisen swung with every ounce of strength in his body, aiming for the goat's spine. But instead of a clean kill, there was just a dull thud. The blade didn't even seem to break the skin. Maybe the fur was too thick, or the blade was too dull, but the goat just let out this pathetic, high-pitched bleat. My stomach turned. I thought, asterisk, "Oh God, this is about to get very messy and very bad, asterisk." He swung again, and again, nothing. Finally, the frustration got to them. The blade was tossed aside and replaced with a handgun. I shouted, "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" I pointed out the obvious. We were all standing in a tight circle around this animal. If a bullet ricocheted, one of us was going home in a bag. He looked around, realized I was right, adjusted his aim, and put a single round into the goat's head. It dropped instantly. If you think that was the end of it, you don't know these people. They immediately cut the animal's throat and began filling a cup with the warm, metallic-smelling blood. One of the men produced a sheet of LSD. He went around the circle, placing a tab under each man's tongue. The ritual required them to wash the acid down with a gulp of the goat blood, a way to seal the sacrifice. I was one of the few who refused. When the cup finally reached me, the blood had already begun to coagulate. It was thick, lumpy, and smelled like a slaughterhouse in the sun. I looked at it and thought, asterisk, I cannot physically swallow this. Asterisk, so I improvised. I dipped my fingers deep into the gore, pulled them out coated in red, and sucked the blood off my knuckles. It was a performance, just like when I was 14. This group wasn't the KKK. They were younger, better armed, and they weren't just playing dress-up. They were preparing for a literal bloodbath. They didn't just want animal blood. They wanted the blood of anyone they deemed an enemy. Jewish Americans, Black Americans, and anyone they labeled a race traitor. They were the most dangerous cell I had ever encountered. But they didn't know that for the last 17 years, I had been the man the government sent to stop people exactly like them. My journey into the FBI began in 1998. By 2002, I had already worked a few small undercover assignments, but I wasn't certified yet. I hadn't gone through the official FBI undercover school. That changed in September 2002, when I arrived at Quantico, Virginia. The FBI Academy is a gauntlet. To even get there, you have to survive a year-long application process. Physical tests, psychological evaluations, polygraphs, grueling interviews, and background checks that dig into every corner of your life. If you make it, you face 20 weeks of intense training. But the undercover school? That's a different beast entirely. It's a 2-week program with no days off. They focus heavily on sleep deprivation. They put you in high-pressure scenarios with actors, trying to break your cover, trying to see if you'll fold when you're exhausted and confused. There were only 20 spots in my class. I saw guys crumble. They'd make a tiny mistake in a simulation using their real name or forgetting a detail of their backstory, and they were out. They'd become delirious from the lack of sleep. But for some reason, I thrived. I loved the role-playing. I loved the chess match of it all. I was learning from the legends, men like Joe Pistone, the real Donnie Brasco, who spent 6 years inside the Bonanno crime family. I remember Joe coming in to speak. I was like a kid in a candy store. I kept trying to get close to him, to soak up every bit of knowledge. He had this habit of walking right up to the desks while he lectured. He kept stepping on my feet. I'd try to tuck my legs back, but he was like a heat-seeking missile for my toes. Finally, he stopped, looked down at me, and growled in that thick New York accent, "Jesus, kid, either you got the biggest feet I've ever seen or I'm blind." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few dollar bills still in full mobster mode and tossed them on my desk. "Here, go get yourself a shoe shine." I just pulled my feet under my chair and nodded. I didn't know then that I would eventually follow in his footsteps, deeper than I ever imagined. The FBI trains us to hunt the worst of the worst. Today, that often means looking at the digital world. Scammers, identity thieves, and fraudsters are constantly mining your personal data, your name, phone number, and even your health records to build profiles. Most people don't realize their data is being sold by brokers every single day. That's where a service like Incogni comes in. They hunt down these data brokers and use legal frameworks to force them to delete your information. They even offer custom removals for specific sites. While you can't truly vanish from the internet, Incogni helps you become as invisible as possible. They're currently offering 60% off for viewers of Fern with the code FERNTV. It's a small step toward protecting yourself in a world where your identity is a commodity. Once I was a certified undercover agent, I looked at my file. On paper, I wasn't impressive. I didn't have an Ivy League degree. I didn't speak 3 languages. My nickname was Big Country because I sounded like I just stepped off a tractor, but that was my greatest asset. I didn't have to act like a blue-collar guy. I was one. I started as an instructor at the undercover school, and that's how I got noticed. The senior undercover agents would watch the simulations, looking for new talent for their cases. Eventually, the right case came along. It was a mission that required someone who could blend into a world of grit and grease. But there's a truth about undercover work that they don't always tell you at the academy. People think it's just acting or lying. In reality, undercover work is the process of building genuine human relationships for the sole purpose of betraying them. It's a heavy burden to carry. My target was the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, the primary rivals of the Hells Angels. These guys were involved in everything: drugs, prostitution, money laundering, and extreme violence. They were notoriously difficult to penetrate. When I first went in, my intel was wrong. I was told they wouldn't be wearing their colors, their vests and patches. But when I walked into the bar, they were decked out in full gear. I couldn't just walk up and say, "Hey, cool patches." I had to make them come to me. I knew a guy named Spanky liked to be the center of attention. So, I out-Spankied him. I told louder jokes. I bought rounds. I commanded the room until he felt the need to reclaim his territory. He called me over, bought me a drink, and introduced me to the crew. I was in, but the real test happened in the bathroom. I was at the urinal when I saw a reflection in the plexiglass of a flyer holder. A massive, muscular guy walked in. I watched him check every stall, making sure we were alone. I thought, asterisk. This is it. I'm about to get my head kicked in. Asterisk. He walked right up next to me and asked, "So, what brings you to Massachusetts?" I had my legend ready. I was Scott Calloway from South Texas, up north for work. I loved Harleys and whiskey. As it turned out, this guy was also named Scott Scotttown. Over the next year and a half, I bonded with Scotttown more than almost anyone in my life. We were cut from the same cloth. We liked the same drinks, the same bikes, the same gym routines. We even had daughters the exact same age. He was like a mirror image of who I might have been if I hadn't taken the path of the law. Then there was Brian De La Vega, known as Clothesline. He became a close friend too. One night, he looked at me and said, "These guys in the club are my brothers, but I don't have many friends I'd take a bullet for." "You're one of those guys, Tex." I had to look him in the eye and nod, while a part of me was screaming, "Asterisk, don't say that, man. Please don't say that." The climax of the Outlaws case involved a massive drug deal I had orchestrated. I convinced them I had a connection to a Mexican cartel. We were going to facilitate a move of 40 kilograms of cocaine and 1,000 pounds of marijuana. The Outlaws were to provide security. The night before the deal, Clothesline led me into a back room of the clubhouse, a room I'd never been in. He told me to strip. They were looking for a wire. The adrenaline hit me like a freight train. I suffered from auditory exclusion. Everything sounded like I was underwater. My vision became a series of still photos. Click, click, click. I was wearing a wire, but it wasn't taped to my chest. It was sewn into my clothes. I stripped down, standing there naked and vulnerable. They found nothing. But then, as I was putting my clothes back on, Clothesline picked up my shirt. He began running his fingers along the seams, right where the device was hidden. I let out a long, shaky sigh. He looked at the shirt, looked at me, and then just tossed it back. I had survived to fight another day. The deal went down at a Holiday Inn in Brockton. 2 moving trucks, millions in cash, and enough drugs to ruin a city. The cartel members and the buyers were all FBI. The outlaws were thrilled. They thought they'd just made $15,000 for a few hours of work.
Get your hands up now.
They didn't know the clock was ticking. 8 months later, I was in a hotel in Nevada. I was burnt out, suffering from stress-induced panic attacks. My phone rang at 4 a.m. It was Scott Town. He was panicking. He'd heard rumors of arrests. He told me he loved me, like a brother. I told him I loved him too. 45 minutes later, a SWAT team breached his door. 15 members were arrested. Scott Town got 7 years. I never saw him again. After the outlaws, I moved on to the KKK. The United Klans of America had a literal hotline. I called it. I spoke to a guy named John Jack, a Jack Daniels enthusiast. I told him I was a musician, a singer. He was desperate because his regular band's lead singer had just been arrested. He invited me to a rally. On the 21st of April, 2017, I found myself at that gated field in the middle of nowhere. Armed Nighthawks in black stood guard. I spent the next few weeks learning their clore and their handbook. I took a Kauno test, character, honor, duty, to earn the right to wear the robe. That night in the field, blindfolded and kneeling, I was knighted with a sword by a man in a green robe. I walked back to my truck thinking, asterisk, I think I just joined the damn clan. Asterisk, but the KKK was old school. The real threat was emerging elsewhere, neo-Nazi accelerationists. This led me to a group called the Base. These weren't guys living in the past. They were looking for a violent future. They were inspired by the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where Heather Heyer was killed. They followed the writings of James Mason, who preached the formation of terror cells to trigger the Boogaloo, the total collapse of society. I applied to join the Base via an encrypted email service. I used the name White Warrior 88. I told them I was a veteran skinhead and an ex-biker. The man on the other end was Norman Spear, actually Ronaldo Nazaro, a former DOJ contractor living in Russia. After a grueling phone interview, I was invited to a vetting in Rome, Georgia. 3 young men met me at a factory. They used a device that looked like a Geiger counter to scan me for electronics. It started beeping like crazy near the back of my truck, right where my team had hidden a GPS tracker. I thought I was dead, but the kid scanning me just looked up at the power lines overhead and said, "Damn, these wires are messing with the signal. Let's go somewhere else." I managed to call my team and tell them to kill the tracker before we reached the next location. I passed the test. Then came the Halloween hate camp. It was a multi-day training session for the Boogaloo. We practiced hand-to-hand combat and weapons drills. These were kids 18 to 25 years old, but they were filled with a terrifying darkness. This was where the goat sacrifice happened. This was where they burned Bibles and American flags, screaming for the death of the country. One of them, Luke Lane, TMB, started talking to me about camping trips. He meant murder. He had a target, a couple involved in Antifa. He wanted us to break into their home, kill them, and burn the house down. Another member, Helter Skelter, asked if he could pop his cherry by being the one to pull the trigger. They were even planning to wear adult diapers because they'd read that you lose control of your bladder the first time you kill someone. At the same time, another cell in Maryland was planning to attack a gun rights rally in Virginia. They wanted to fire into the crowd, hoping to start a crossfire between protesters and police, a spark for the race war. We had to move fast. On the 15th of January 2020, I picked up Luke Lane for lunch. I faked a mechanical issue with my truck and pulled over near a prearranged SWAT position. An undercover agent in a civilian car pulled up to distract him. While they talked, a Bearcat armored vehicle roared over the hill. I jumped into the back of the agent's car as the SWAT team swarmed. We dismantled the base that day. Luke Lane got 6 years. Others got more. But the ideology hasn't vanished. The base is reportedly seeing a resurgence, and their founder still lives in Russia. I retired in June 2021. At my ceremony, surrounded by the people I'd spent a lifetime protecting, they declared June 30th Scott Payne Day. It was a strange end to a career built on being someone else. I spent 25 years in the dark, pretending to be a monster so that the real ones couldn't hurt the world. I still think about that 14-year-old boy and the demon he saw. I realized that the demon wasn't in the red mist. It was in the hearts of the men I hunted. And I'm just glad I was the one standing in their way,